It suddenly dawned on him that he might have been found out ever since that damn letter went missing. Another act of foolishness in losing such a highly dangerous and incriminating item. Men choosing to work in the treacherous trade of spying knew only too well the fatal cost of such seemingly minor mishaps, and the indulgence of strong drink with overly seductive wenches only served to compound the error of his ways. His face was sheened in sweat as he wiped the vomit from his mouth and chin, the air pungent with its acidic smell. He took on the appearance of a trapped animal, the drink-reddened eyes now bright with terror and darting frantically about the small cubicle in fearful desperation. He'd felt the remaining confidence drain out with a flood of vomit into the toilet, and realised he had little hope of bluffing his way through with the crowd at the bar. The rising fear tightened its icy grip and coiled in his empty stomach like a reptile. He wrung his hands together, clenched his teeth, and squeezed his eyes tight shut in an all-out effort to stem the rising panic. But the sinking feeling that the game was up began to consume him. At once he decided the only way out was to run, and in that instant he noticed a small window was large enough to crawl through. He had to be quick. He had been away from the bar just a short time, but being almost certain that the Cervantes group had tumbled to his spying activity, allowed no margin for error. He reached up and twisted aside the latch to push hard at the small window that jerked open with a small squeak of hinges and the creaking of the old wooden frame. It seemed dreadfully loud in the dark stillness of the night, but he was committed now, and there was no turning back. He pushed it open to its fullest extent and scrambled through without difficulty, thankful for his skinny frame and wiry muscles. Dropping the short distance to the ground, he rolled over and froze for a moment, keenly scanning the area and the surrounds for any sign of suspicious movement, and slowly he began to rise. It was then that the surrounding shadows came alive. The panic that had well before now constricted his chest and almost stifled his breathing as he perceived the dark shapes manifesting in the gloom of the shadows. And then came the voice that froze his frantically beating heart. "Going somewhere, Kurt?" sneered Hamish, the voice floating from the darkness on a current of mockery and sarcasm. Again the spy froze to the spot and began to tremble as the men silently emerged from the dark shadows into the pale glow of the moonlight. Dark sockets for eyes and the grim slash of downturned lipless mouths were all he could see of their faces. They silently grouped around him as he desperately looked about for an avenue of escape and saw none. The game was up, and the awful hopelessness of his situation descended upon him in an avalanche of despair. He suddenly felt his arms seized from both sides, while the sharp pinprick stab of a knife bit into the flesh of his back to prod him forward with his captors. "This way, matey. We've got some questions you might just like to answer," came a voice from behind. They dragged him back into the tavern, his face drained of all colour and looking as pale as the very moonlight outside. In no time at all, his hands had been secured behind his back with rope, after which he was then tied securely to a chair. Clearly, the Cervantes pirates were taking no chances, and for the first time that night the spy began to fear for his life. The overpowering instinct for survival suddenly flooded his being, and he began to babble incoherently. The sudden splash of cold beer into his face put a stop to the whining, and he blinked the liquid from his eyes as he stared back at the hostile faces of the group surrounding him. "It would be better for you if you just tell us what you're up to." The statement was matter-of-fact and without emotion, heavily underscoring the seriousness of the intent. "And it will be better for you if you start right now." The golden rule of all spies is that of plausible denial, and Kurt knew he had broken this intractable rule in an unforgivable lapse of judgment. But still he was compelled to try something. The first feeble effort at denial sounded pathetically false in the heavy silence of the room. I don't know what this is all about. I've done nothing wrong, I tell you. The stammering voice, high and tight with fear, the words coming out staccato fashion in ragged bursts of speech. It was then he sensed as much as heard a movement from behind, and fearing a sudden blow, winced and quickly turned his head. His wide staring eyes caught sight of the rope curling up and over the tavern roof beam, the lynching noose end snaking down to dance and dangle no less than 2 meters from where he was bound tightly to the chair. From behind the noose, Corey glared at the spy, meeting his wide-eyed, fearful stare with an expression of stone. "You have a choice, matey. Tell us the truth of what you're doing here in Cervantes, or you will feel this rope." He paused for the words to take effect, slowly walking back and forth behind the noose that swung in a lazy ellipse just 2 meters off the dusty floor. Kurt was unable to take his eyes from the swinging noose, becoming fixed like a mouse locked in the stare of a death adder. As Corey went on, "As for me, I don't much care whether you tell us anything or not, since your guilt is already proven. But let's just say I'm curious." He suddenly whipped his face around to the spy. "So what's it to be then?" Kurt's mind was numb with fear, his thinking drowned in a blur of raging white noise. Still, he had to try and bluff, or the angry group would swing him for sure. He blurted out once again, spittle flying from his mouth amidst the sudden torrent of words. "But I've done nothing wrong. You can't hang an innocent man." But his feeble protestations were cut short by the screeching sound of a table being dragged across the tavern floor to stand directly beneath the noose. 2 of the girls adjusted the height of the rope while the men lifted the spy, still tied to the chair, up onto the table. Someone slipped the noose around his neck, and his heartbeat pumped, furiously driven by a rush of pure adrenaline. "It's your last chance, matey," came a voice from the upturned faces, and he felt the noose tighten as someone made it fast to one of the solid upright support beams. "Please, I'm just an innocent traveller. I've done nothing." All of a sudden the table was wrenched away with a terrible screech, and the spy swung free as the chair legs lost their grip on the table's edge and fell away into thin air. A dreadful silence filled the tavern, accentuating the sound of the creaking rope as it swung the doomed man from the overhead beam. His breath cut off by the tightening rope, his face flushed a dark scarlet, while bloodshot eyes bulged alarmingly from their sockets. He saw the sea of faces looking up at him, swimming across his vision in blurred circles, and in a few moments they darkened at the edges and grew dim. The hand of death reached out to drag him to the grave, and he imagined he felt its icy fingers curl about his ankles to then claw its way towards his very heart. All of a sudden he crashed to the floor after 3 of the men unfastened the rope from its fixture and paid out the slack. The chair was still in mid-swing when it fell, landing heavily on its side and splintering the left legs into matchwood to lay as thoroughly broken as the spy's resistance. Kylie dug her fingers into where the rope had bitten deep into Kurt's neck. A sudden rasping intake of air sucked deep into his bursting lungs as the noose came free. The men then unbound him from the broken chair and shoved him into another, his body going limp as he slumped forward to rest his arms while gasping for breath. "This is your last chance. Why are you spying on us, and who are you working for?" He knew any further attempt to hold out would most surely seal his fate, although it was still unclear that if he told the truth as to what would become of him anyway. As though aware of his troubled thoughts, Sarah spoke for the first time that evening. You can save yourself if you tell us what we want to know. Then you can work for us against whoever it is that sent you to do this dirty work. It seems to be a pretty straightforward choice. Your worthless life ends here and now otherwise. She spoke in a chillingly matter-of-fact tone, and it was clear she meant every word. Kurt looked up and met the eyes of the Cervantes pirates and decided he wanted to live after all. Captain Bloodbeard of the Dynamite Bay Pirates sent me here. At the mention of this dreaded name, fearful glances exchanged among the group, but all faces turned back to Kurt as he hurried on. He has a map, an ancient map, I'm told, that says there's some sort of treasure buried here at Cervantes. My job was to find out whether or not anyone here knew of it. What sort of treasure? Demanded Matthew. I don't know. No one knows, and from what I'm told, even the map don't say what it is, gasped Kurt, his eyes now downcast in total defeat. Does the map tell where it's hidden? Asked Sarah. I've never seen the map, but the whisper is that it's supposed to be somewhere down at Thirsty Point. That's all I know, I swear. He sat back in the chair and looked to his captors, wondering whether or not they might decide to hang him after all. All right, we believe you. Now, in order to save your wretched hide, you can work for us. McAvoy made the decision with absolute finality. Kurt went limp with relief. The looming death sentence suddenly lifted, although his future still very uncertain. Two of the men moved forward on the command from McAvoy and dragged the spy to the furthest corner of the tavern, while the others had a hasty council, deciding what their best plan of action should be. They were in imminent danger and needed to formulate some sort of guard action without delay. The group at the bar spoke in low, urgent whispers. Our best move would be to send him back with false information, declared Hamish. This might at least buy us some time in order to make our own fleet ready for battle, because once Bloodbeard has the smell of treasure up that beaky nose, he'll be coming our way. What sort of false information do you mean? And what's to stop him blabbing that we found him out as soon as he gets there? Came the anxious query from Kylie. I will, volunteered Matthew, who had thus far been silent. I can follow him from a safe distance and watch out for what he says and does. He turned to one of the wenches. Lorna, you can help me with a disguise so that he won't recognise me in the crowd. Give us some 20 minutes, then set him on his way. Without a word, several of the wenches followed Lorna and Matthew from the tavern, casting dark glances at the spy huddled in the corner under the guard of two sturdy men. They allowed a good half an hour to elapse since Matthew had left the tavern with the wenches, and decided it was time to let Kurt the spy go. At a signal from Hamish, he was dragged to his feet and bundled over to the group at the bar. It was Corey who spoke, his voice low and menacing. Listen carefully. We've decided to spare your miserable life in exchange for a small service. But be warned, if you try any clever tricks or pull a sneaky double-cross, our people in Dynamite Bay will be watching your every move. Oh yes, he continued, stepping away from the bar and coming to stand directly in front of Kurt, so as to more fully intimidate. Kurt might guess the Cervantes pirates didn't have any people in place at Dynamite Bay, but was he willing to risk his life on it? If you do try a double-cross on us, just so much as a hint of anything suspicious, our people will snuff you out like a candle. He snapped his fingers right in front of Kurt's eyes so as to emphasise the threat. The spy blinking furiously, then looking to the other men in the hope of learning something that might betray what Corey was saying. But he was almost certain it was bluff, but how was he to know for sure? Corey spoke again. You can tell your uncouth master that some sort of treasure was discovered here at Hangover Bay some years ago. it was taken south to Perth, and that was the last anyone has ever heard of it. No one flinched at the attempted deception, and neither did they suppose the spy was likely to believe it. Even so, if there was the slimmest chance that it might avert a full-scale war with the Dynamite Bay fleet, then it was certainly worth a try. At length, the men guarding Kurt unbound his wrists and roughly shoved him to the tavern door. Everyone proceeded out into the moonlight, just the lantern swinging over the outside door, spilling further light upon the scene. The spy was then pushed away from the group, a deadly silence hanging heavy in the air as he stood for a moment and took measure of his situation. A moment was all he needed before he took to his heels and ran for his life, off into the surrounding darkness. He heard a single voice call out from behind, "One false move, just one, and you'll be fish bait." But the last of what was said faded from his ears as his frantically pumping legs made rapid progress down the road. As he left the town on the northern road to Dynamite Bay, he failed to notice the dark shadow of Matthew unfold from the bushes and follow silently behind. Kurt half ran, half stumbled the distance between the two towns, his mind churning over and over the worrisome plight his spying activity had landed him in. At one point he came to an abrupt halt as the notion of fleeing south to Fremantle and possible safety entered his mind, but thinking it through, he realised either group would surely track him down, no matter how long it took. No, there was no escape, and he had to see it through no matter what. With a sinking feeling, he set off again, consumed with paralysing dread at having to face Bloodbeard, while undecided as how he might best handle the potentially deadly situation. Did the Cervantes pirates really have an agent in place? This and many other worries beset the spy as he ran on through the night. It was a calmer and more composed Matthew who kept pace some 200 metres behind in the darkness, never losing sight of the jogging figure up ahead in the moonlight, but careful not to get too close and betray his presence. The two figures pressed on throughout the night, fleeting shadows within the shadows. Somewhere in the darkness, a small animal screamed in terror, and a moment later, an unseen bird of prey screeched in triumph. The end of this difficult journey came as a great relief to Matthew, who could now mingle among the townsfolk while still keeping an eye on Kurt. They entered the town, passing the outer lying stables, and Matthew managed to slip in behind his quarry undetected. As luck would have it, this was the morning of market day in the town, which saw bustling activity in spite of the early hour. Stalls were being set up in the marketplace along the quay, while the tempting aroma of freshly cooked breakfast food drifted on the morning sea breeze. Both men were ravenously hungry, having expended such energy throughout the night. But Matthew hung back until Kurt had seated himself at the quayside inn table and began to feast before he himself bought something a little more modest from a street vendor and ate slowly. Kurt greedily chomped into his food like a starved animal, his eyes constantly darting about the crowd, searching for possible hidden enemies, hunting for any suspicious sign or indication that he might be under covert surveillance. The corners of his ceaselessly moving eyes twitched in a nervous tick as he scanned every passer-by for any potential foe. Matthew casually sat at a table on the roadside alfresco curb of a neighbouring inn, with his back squarely towards his target of surveillance. He had a clear view of Kurt's reflection in the facing storefront window, and was therefore able to monitor the failed spy's every tense movement without so much as a sideways glance. After Kurt failed to detect anything suspicious, he visibly began to relax and ordered another serve of hot breakfast food, as though in celebration. He'd been reasonably sure the Cervantes pirates didn't have any agents in place here at Dynamite Bay, but wasn't prepared to risk his life on the assumption. Matthew ate slowly and methodically while pretending to be engrossed in reading something from the table. Kurt eventually convinced himself there was no imminent danger here in Dynamite Bay, save for that of reporting the failure of his spying mission to Bloodbeard. The very thought made his blood run cold. Immediately he lost his appetite, shoving the last of the food across the table as he contemplated what he should do to save his miserable hide. At length he stood up and made to leave, a certain stiffness in his bearing and manner indicating he had arrived at some important decision and was about to adopt a clear course of action. Matthew watched Kurt's reflection in the glass pass him close by, but it was clear his own actions were beyond suspicion, having sat with his back to the troubled spy and paid him no attention whatsoever. Kurt strode off in the direction of Dynamite Bay Town Square, like a man on a mission, and Matthew was careful to wait until he was almost out of sight before shoving some money on the table and taking off after him. It was almost certain Kurt would report to Bloodbeard of his being found out and nearly hanged, and it was equally uncertain as to whether or not his close brush with death would inspire any sympathy from the Dynamite Bay pirates. It was known they didn't like failure nor seldom took prisoners, and those they did would have been better off perishing before falling into their cruel hands. There were even reports of cannibalism, and Matthew shuddered at the thought as he hurried on through the town. At the centre of the Dynamite Bay Town Square hung a large iron triangle with a steel bar dangling from a length of woolly string. This apparatus was to ring out an alarm in the event of an emergency, such as a fire or attack from other marauding pirates. Fortunately for the inhabitants, it had not been rung for some years, and when it suddenly clanged into life on that clear sunlit morning, it took everyone by complete surprise. Kurt swung the bar about the centre of the triangle to rattle out in a furious racket, and as soon as the townsfolk came to their wits and realised what it was, they quickly gathered around and waited for Kurt to finish ringing out the alarm and speak. It seemed all the folk from the quayside marketplace had rushed to see what nature of alarm had suddenly beset the town, and the silence that hung in the morning air was broken only by the crying of seagulls as they wheeled and spun overhead. Pirates believed these birds to be the reincarnated souls of long-dead mariners, and their gathering presence overhead a forbidding omen. Lifting his chin to show the livid red rope burn around his neck, Kurt addressed the hushed crowd in a clear and determined voice. I have just escaped the murderous clutches of the pirates of Cervantes and learned that their sneaky dogs are planning an attack on our town. This blatant lie was at once greeted by angry howls and shouts of protests. He had no doubt whatsoever the townsfolk believed every false word. The plan of turning the tables had been carefully thought through and determined to be his best bet for staying alive. He pulled down the neck of his torn shirt to demonstrate the facts of his outrageous statement. Here, see this, he yelled. Just because I'm a peace-loving seafarer from our quiet town, they decided to hang me for the fun of it. More shouts and angry snarls coming from the crowd, who drank in his every lie without question or pause. He knew he had them eating the lies out of the palm of his hand, as did Matthew, who had discreetly hung at the edge of the mob in readiness for a quick escape, and the next impassioned outburst from Kurt determined he should move without delay. Already they have sent spies among us, shouted Kurt, who, as though to lend credence to this statement, looked hard into the crowd as though in search of traitors in their midst. At once the now furious mob eagerly began scowling among themselves for strange and unfamiliar faces. Matthew had already melted back into an alley so as to remove himself from scrutiny, and having noted the sudden alertness of the mob, then moved quickly away towards the docks. If he were to be of any use at all here, it could now only be by sabotaging the Dynamite Bay ship's capacity for war, or at least as many as he could manage. The news of the pending trouble wouldn't take long to reach the docks, but for the moment he had the all-important element of surprise working in his favour. The increasing commotion at the town square saw all dockside activity cease, and he arrived at the deserted scene, save for that a single watchman. This sluggish ruffian seemingly took no interest in anything else other than trying to catch a fish from the first ship at the jetty. Matthew made no hesitation, and tiptoeing up the gangplank, then right up behind the man, fetched him a hefty blow to the base of the skull with the ship's belaying pin. The careless watchman rolled over without a sound. Matthew quickly removed the watchman's long greatcoat and three-cornered hat, which he slipped into with ease, in order to remain undetected for a little while longer. He then weighted the slumped body down by tying it to a wooden crate of grape shot before shoving it over the side. The resulting splash sounded unnaturally loud and went quiet to the dockside, but no one other than Matthew was there to hear it. The body sank out of sight in an instant, leaving a thin trail of bubbles in its rippling wake, and having noted the weights were doing their job, he turned his attention to the covert task of sabotage. Time was working against him, so he moved swiftly and silently among the cannon of the first three-masted man-of-war. Any casual passer-by might think him to be carrying out some sort of maintenance or repair work, but for the moment the docks remained deserted, while back at the town square, Kurt, still the focus of everyone's attention, whipped the mob into further frenzy. He managed this for a while longer until, inevitably, the initial excitement passed, and as the general hullabaloo began to subside, someone shouted that they had to bring this dangerous news to the attention of Bloodbeard, and this was the moment Kurt had been dreading. The hardcore Dynamite Bay pirates lived in Skull Gully Cave, just on the northern outskirts of the town, and Kurt knew this to be a place of execution for those who failed their bloodthirsty master. His face paled and his mouth went dry, but he knew there was no way out other than to face up to the worst of West Australian pirates with his concocted story. He now had enough of the townsfolk fully convinced, and assuming his only precarious safety lay in their growing numbers, called at once for them to make haste to Skull Gully Cave. It worked perfectly. As though possessed of the same mind, the crowd gathered behind Kurt and struck out for the northern reaches of the town. It took no more than 15 minutes fast walking through the quieted streets, pacing the gentle rise out of the town, before they came in sight of the looming cave that struck terror into so many hearts. The rock entrance had been sculpted to resemble a grinning skull, and few of the townsfolk would venture anywhere near the place if they could avoid it. Those who regularly came and went from this awful sight were the lowest order of subhumans, indulging unspeakable sin. Murder and mayhem for these ruffians was as commonplace as daily food, as indeed some might be seen to actually feeding upon the violence as a nourishment to their eternally condemned souls. As the mob reached the foot of the cave, an expectant hush descended about them like a dark blanket of fear. 2 battle-scarred sentries emerged from the yawning mouth of the cave, which for Kurt looked as inviting as the grave itself. The morning sun glinted on their drawn swords. Steeling himself for the task, he stepped forward. "I have urgent news for Captain Bloodbeard," he declared with as much confidence as he could muster. The sentries squinted down, clearly unaccustomed to being out in the early sunlight, and the taller one's terribly scarred face twisted into recognition of the spy, and wordlessly bid him enter. Kurt dutifully stepped forward and felt his blood chill a few degrees more when the crowd backing him up was abruptly halted at the cave mouth by the other sentry. He was on his own. The stalactites reaching down from the cave roof took on the aspects of bloodied dragon's teeth, as he stepped further into the cavernous depths of the tunnel leading to the main chamber. The tunnel dropped down a gentle decline to wind through a series of sharp bends before rising up once again. His eyes gradually grew accustomed to the dim torchlight flickering from the walls, and he moved forward with increasing dread dogging his every step. His heart sank to his boots when he heard the unmistakable roar of this most dreadfully evil man, Captain Bloodbeard, bellow out from up ahead. The spine-chilling sound sprang from the glistening damp walls of the cave and filled him with terror at every bouncing echo. It was the sound that came from the bowels of hell, and he moved inexorably closer with every lead-weighted step. Overhead, pinprick lights of bats' eyes stared unwinking as dark jewels as he passed below, and occasionally he heard the rustle of wings as they stretched and preened their leathery black skin. He caught sight of a large snake slowly coiling itself up and around a thick stalactite with a bat struggling helplessly in its lethal jaws, and countless cockroaches, spiders, and dark furry rats scuttled before him as he progressed deeper into the cave. At length he emerged into the cavernous main chamber, a huge opening lit only by a series of brightly burning torches set into the slimy green walls. Ringing the sandy floor, he noted the broken skulls and scattered bones of those to have incurred Bloodbeard's displeasure in the past, and wondered briefly if his own skeletal remains might join them in the very near future. Looking up to the raised throne at the far end of the gallery, he saw the massive frame of this dangerous creature, Bloodbeard, a huge and terrifying ogre of a man. His shadow danced and trembled on the wall of the cave, and for a moment he appeared to Kurt as being the very devil himself. Bloodbeard rose up from his throne, his leaping shadow taking on even greater and more grotesque proportions, and stepped forward, glaring down at the spy and resting his huge, hairy paw of a hand upon the hilt of his bulky sword. When the voice eventually came, it was unnaturally soft and reminded Kurt of a deadly snake's hiss the moment before it struck. "And what have you to report back then, Mr. Spy?" inquired Bloodbeard in an unnaturally soft voice, his long face glaring down at Kurt. The beaky hook nose curving over a sharply downturned and seemingly lipless mouth hidden beneath a shaggy red beard. A picture of savage cruelty and limitless contempt. Deep shadows ringed the piercing blue eyes of fire, and looking up into those terrible eyes, Kurt imagined he saw a window into hell itself, the reflection of the flickering wall torches reinforcing the chillingly macabre impression. Kurt struggled to find his voice, a rising panic swamping thought to drown him in a sea of fear. At last he managed. Reaching up and yanking down his shirt front, he exposed the red welt of the lynching rope burn and blurted out his own distorted version of the series of events that saw him standing before his master empty-handed. Bloodbeard said nothing, fixing the trembling spy with those blazing eyes of fire, his huge hand twitching and tightening on the hilt of his sword. Kurt knew he was once again a heartbeat away from violent death, but clung to his fabricated story of making a heroic escape so as to get back to Dynamite Bay and courageously give a warning of impending attack. When he finally stopped blurting out the last of his fanciful story, it was clear Bloodbeard believed little of it, but luckily for the spy, the big man's attention was fully focused on what might really have become of the buried treasure. He certainly didn't believe the falsehood of it being discovered at Hangover Bay and spirited away to Fremantle, having come into possession of the original map in a recent raid on some cargo ships off the coast of Port Hedland. Isaiah had kept his bargain with the keeper ghost and never breathed a word of the treasure's existence, but before he died he had made a detailed map. And, as is the unfortunate habit of treasure maps, it was only a matter of time before it had fallen into the wrong hands. Bloodbeard knew from this map that the treasure was actually buried at Thirsty Point. Suddenly, turning from Kirk with a sweep of his floor-length greatcoat, he called over his shoulder a reprieve of sorts. "Summon my captains for a council of war," he demanded abruptly, and walked slowly back to his throne, one hand stroking his unkempt beard while deep in thought. Kirk began to hope that he might get to live after all, but that was still uncertain, as indeed was almost everything about this evil man, save for the fact that violent death was his constant companion. He even smelled of it. The whole place reeked of it to almost suffocate the spy as he choked a feeble response and hurriedly turned to leave. He thought he might fade with terror at any moment, but once away from the inner cavern he began to regain control. He then went to summon the pirate captains. War was about to be unleashed along the West Australian Midwest coast. Back at the dockside, Matthew had made the most of carrying out as much covert sabotage as was possible. Vital ropes had been half cut through so as to snap clean under strain when needed most. Several cannons had been booby-trapped to fully explode at the first discharge, and mainsails had been slashed through at the corners so as to tear away from their holding lines when a strong wind took them. He worked quickly and methodically, knowing that as soon as he saw a movement headed his way, he must flee the scene at once. He kept his head down and hat pulled low while he rowed, as it was only a matter of time before one of the crewmen looked outward and saw him passing. And sure enough, the moment came not more than 3 oar strokes later. He caught a movement from the corner of his eye of a sailor coming to the ship's stern rail and staring down at him before calling out a friendly greeting. Without looking up, Matthew waved briefly and continued rowing, the bluff seeming to work, while the man on deck watched him for a few agonizing moments longer before turning his attention to more urgent matters back on deck. It wasn't long before he was well clear of the now busy fleet, where he moored the rowboat at the southernmost end of the jetty. It was then he decided to rid himself of the disguise. If they found out the real watchman had been done away with, they'd immediately go checking about the ships for any sign of interference or possible sabotage. All the while the Dynamite Bay pirates believed the watchman had been on active duty, suspicion would be at a minimum. So it was crucial to maintain this belief or risk his undoing the morning's work. Climbing up onto the jetty and skirting the southern outskirts of the town, he came across a disused cellar below an abandoned building where he hastily hid the greatcoat and hat in the darkest corner. No one would find it in a hurry, with the fate of the watchman unknown for a good while longer. Emerging back into the sunlight and seeing no one around, he made his way quickly to the outlying stables, where he knew the horses to be corralled, having noticed them on his way into town earlier on in the day. Here he planned to steal one for the return journey to Cervantes and scatter the rest into the bush. It took less than 5 minutes to secure a sturdy saddle and select a strong mount to spirit him away in good time. Just as he was opening the corral gate, however, he heard a shout of alarm and looked up to see a group of men staring at him from the corner of the stable house. The game was up. He hurried to push the corral gate open, the shouts of alarm growing angrier and more urgent with every second, now they realized the mischief he was up to. At last the gate fell open, and as soon as it did so, he swung up into the saddle of his horse and charged it at the now nervous herd gathered in the far corner of the corral. In seconds the horses were out and gone, streaking away with the wind and scattering in all directions, leading away from the town, the rolling thunder of fast-flying hooves. The outraged shouts and yells from the now pursuing mob rose to absolute fury and casting a quick glance over his shoulder, he caught sight of someone passing out muskets to eagerly grabbing hands that set to the frantic loading of guns. Being high in the saddle, he knew he presented an easy target, so digging his heels hard into his mount, he leant forward to give chase to the fleeting horses and went on to hunch down the saddle. In that very instant, a staccato crack of musket fire rang out on billows of sparks and white smoke from the rifles, and the lead balls whistled death sighs about his head and neck. Another volley, some nicking at his hair and another grazing the side of his leg to tear a jagged hole in the trousers. More ragged shots, many going wild now until the sledgehammer blow in his upper left shoulder almost sent him flying from the saddle under its heavy impact. At once he could feel the warm blood run freely beneath his armpit and down his side, his head spinning momentarily while he desperately fought to stay in the saddle. While his powerful horse charged at full gallop away from the town, the other horses ran down the road up ahead. Suddenly the musket balls were falling short of the mark, making dull thuds in the gravel and ripping through the surrounding bush with sharp, splintering noises. He was at last out of range, the ragged crackle of musket fire dying away in the rapidly widening distance. Even though Matthew was aware the enemy had no horses to come after him, it wouldn't be long before someone managed to recapture a stray, whereafter the chase would be on. The sudden loss of blood from the musket ball wound needed to be taken care of right away, or he'd never survive the journey. After riding hard for a full 10 minutes, he slowed to a trot and pulled the mount up beneath the shade of an overhanging chua tree at the Hill River crossing and examined the damage. Dismounting and allowing the horse a well-earned drink, he inspected the wound. It seemed the ball had passed right through, and the painful, throbbing ache was becoming almost intolerable. Cutting a wedge of material from his torn trouser leg with a knife, he stuffed the rag into the wound so as to stem the bleeding as much as possible, before mounting up again and spurring the horse back into action in the direction of Cervantes. He had to sound the alarm. The Dynamite Bay battle fleet would soon be sailing south within a matter of hours. Meanwhile, back at Cervantes, ship's crews held an urgent council of war. Assuming the worst was about to descend upon them, they agreed to split into teams. The first group, led by Corey and Hamish, fixed to make ready the Cervantes fleet for war, while another smaller team was sent to see if they could hunt down any treasure in the region of Thirsty Point. The latter comprised of the three wenches, Lorna, Georgina and Cheyenne, backed up by the bomb-making specialist Cameron. This crew set off at once for the beaches of Thirsty Point, although no one had any clear idea as to how they might locate the mythical treasure, if indeed it did exist. The white sandy beach itself, they froze as one when they heard the sound of angry voices up ahead. Ducking low and hastily crawling up to the top of the nearest sand dune, they cautiously peered through the tufted grass. The first item to arrest their attention was the Dynamite Bay Corsair light raider, moored just a couple of 100 metres out beyond the limpid shallows, its flag fluttering mockingly in the light onshore breeze. As they identified this, they spied the source of the raised voices. It seemed the invaders now gathered at the water's edge were in some sort of disagreement over an item they were all studying intently. So much so they neglected to post a guard and had therefore been sprung only moments after landing in their rowboat. It was Cheyenne who spoke. "They've got a map. Maybe it's the treasure map." The others nodded in agreement without speaking. The Dynamite Bay pirates, much too close to risk unnecessary conversation. The afternoon sunlight glistened on the turquoise waters, gently lapping at the dark hull of the pirate ship riding easily at anchor, making the scene look deceptively calm and tranquil, instead of the lethal battleground it was soon to become. As soon as the Cervantes group realised what they'd stumbled into, Cameron slid to the base of the dune and began urgently making a grenade for instant use against their invading foes. His hands moved quickly as he expertly assembled the deadly device. No one spoke a word as the wenches kept a careful watch on the pirates on the beach. All of a sudden, they could hear Hamish and Corey's group coming through the sand dunes in the direction of the Cervantes fleet moored in Ronsard Bay. And so too could the Dynamite Bay pirates, who at once ran to the cover of a nearby dune and readied their muskets in ambush. In seconds, Hamish and Corey's group would walk unprotected into a deadly field of fire and Lorna Hester Cameron to hurry with the bomb. The moment she spoke, he grinned up at the girls, a large, round, dull grey object with a stubby, protruding wick balanced in the palm of his hand. Without a word, he crabbed up to the top of the sand dune to peer down upon the Dynamite Bay pirates, lying in ambush a short distance away. He held the grenade for one of the wenches to light the fuse, the striking of the flint disturbingly loud, but promptly taken away with the light onshore breeze. The fuse crackled into life just as Hamish and Corey led their men around the corner to come almost within range of the muskets readied against them. The morning sun glinted on the crossed bandoliers, brass buckles and dangling swords, giving the Dynamite Bay pirates an even better focus for their long-barrelled sights. Cameron held back his arm and tossed the bomb in a high arc, the spitting smoke trail suddenly seen by an alert Hamish, who, upon sighting it, immediately guessed they were in danger. He alerted the group, "Get down, everyone, take cover!" So saying, the men jumped and scattered to either side of the trail, just as the muskets barked loudly from the top of the dune. Billowing white smoke trailed crazy spirals around tongues of flame and hot red sparks from the front of ambush. The split second's warning was enough for the first volley to miss as the musket ball slammed into the sand around their targets. Miraculously, no one was hit. Before another musket volley could be readied, however, the lazily spinning bomb landed amongst the group of Dynamite Bay pirates and exploded instantly in a blinding flash of thunderous noise, flame, and a dense burst of sand. One man was hurled into the air to land with his clothes and hair still smoking like a vandalised rag doll some metres away, while the others were killed outright in the powerful blast. Cameron and his team charged down the sand dune to inspect the damage, while Georgina searched around carefully for the map she had hoped might have survived the explosion. Corey and Hamish then appeared over the top of the other dune and immediately took stock of the situation. Georgina called out to them, "They had a map, let's see if we can find it." Together, both groups hurriedly searched the coat pockets of the dead pirates until Cheyenne stopped them cold by holding up a scrap of still smouldering parchment. The expression on her face said it all, and she called a halt to the grisly search without delay. "I think this is what we wanted, but it doesn't seem to be of much use to us now." All that remained of the treasure map was the blackened edging, which upon examination showed sections of the Cervantes coastline and some scrappy details of Thirsty Point, but any vital or relevant information had been ruined in the blast. Cameron shook his head and looked over to Corey and Hamish. "Well, it was either this or risk losing you. We really had no choice." The men nodded their understanding, and after a brief discussion agreed to carry on with their respective tasks. It was even more urgent now to ready the Cervantes fleet for war as soon as possible. It was also agreed to make use of the dead pirates' clothing for another ruse, which the group then set about removing from the corpses. All of a sudden, they heard the rattle of a drawing anchor chain, and looking up, they noticed the 3 watchmen left aboard to guard the Dynamite Bay Corsair, who were now frantically hauling anchor and unfurling sail in the hope of making a clean getaway. 8 of the Cervantes pirates rushed to the rowboat and shoving off into the shallows began to row furiously out to intercept them before the sails could take wind. One of the Corsair crew opened fire with a musket, but the shot splashed inches wide of the oncoming rowboat. The return musket fire dropped him where he stood, along with the other two easy targets while struggling with the sails aloft in the upper yardsparts. Within minutes, the rowboat bumped up hard alongside, the occupants then quickly scrambling aboard to secure the Corsair without further resistance. Back ashore, the wenches had been studying the map intently for a few moments before Georgina called out again, "This must be a copy. Just take a look at the parchment. I mean, that spy Kurt told us it was an ancient map, and in spite of the burning, it's obvious that this has been made up of more recent material. Here, look." Once again, the ruined map became the focus of attention until Corey called for his own group to hurry. If there's another map, maybe the original, then perhaps it might show up somewhere, but for the moment we have to get a move on. There's no time to lose. And so saying, the two groups went about their allotted tasks. The corpses of the vanquished invaders were then dragged to the far side of the point and floated out to sea. The sharks that silently patrolled the deep shadows of the outer reef would promptly take care of these. The captured enemy Corsair soon joined them to have her light cannon and ammunition stripped and transferred. Corey and Hamish had another role for this vessel to play. Their own fleet was made up of smaller ships than the Dynamite Bay vessels of war, but the Cervantes pirates knew they had the advantage of manoeuvrability over their larger and therefore more cumbersome foes. It wasn't long before the Cervantes fleet was bristling with light cannon and assorted weaponry. Clearly, in a pitched battle, the odds were against them, but expert seamanship combined with skillful tactics could still win the day once the cannons began to blaze. They were counting on it. The crews worked quickly and efficiently, no one wasting breath on idle chatter while preparing for all-out war. Cameron and the wenches continued to quarter every last inch of Thirsty Point Beach. The sun passed over their heads and began its slow arc of descent to the ocean's glittering horizon. Yet still nothing that might indicate the hiding place of buried treasure could be found. Without the vital and missing section of the map, the searching was useless. Just as the shadows were beginning to lengthen, they heard the whinny and snort of an approaching horse wandering exhausted through the dunes, and looking up they spotted Matthew slumped in the saddle, his upper torso soaked in dark red blood. They rushed to his aid and helped him down from his mount, Lorna taking the sweat-soaked horse aside and providing it with water poured from her canteen into her cupped hands. The others revived Matthew with more water, distressed at his terrible wound, but relieved he'd survived his perilous task. As they lay him down in the soft sand, he looked up and blinked, a snow smile spreading over his sun-tanned features in spite of the pain. He croaked out a whisper, the effort draining his last reserves of strength. Kurt the spy did exactly as we predicted, but I managed to plant a few surprises for them among their warships. He coughed a little and took a deep breath before going on. If they don't come during the night, then we can expect them at dawn. We must be ready for them. We absolutely must. And with that, he slipped into unconsciousness once again. Soon, sunset was upon them, and all gathered at the water's edge to watch the fiery glow descend below the horizon, while casting a lustrous golden gleam across the stilled water. Several patches of light, fluffy cloud drifting over the ocean to become gilt-edged in the sun's dying glow. Already, small parties had gathered up enough driftwood for a sizable fire, and the fish traps set earlier in the day provided enough of a catch for the evening meal, whereby the gathering dusk saw small groups reap the harvest and make ready to cook. The Cervantes ships were as ready for battle as they were ever going to be, with the vigilant watchmen doubled up on every vessel, so those ashore settled down to watch the stars come out in all their splendour. Eyes glistened in the firelight's glow and sparks drifted lazily up into the starry sky, adding further pinpricks of light to the shimmering heavens. As the night closed about them, they huddled around the fire, no one knowing for sure what the following day might bring. In spite of this, a seemingly comfortable silence descended upon the group, each somehow very much alone with their thoughts of the battle to come. Sensing the melancholy mood, Shana sang a lilting song. As the last words of the song lyrics died away, a weird silence wrapped around the group huddled around the blazing beach fire. No one spoke a word, but all could sense something extraordinary was about to happen. The silence grew heavier still, even the fire now not making a sound, even though the occasional sparks flew up into the starry sky. And then it began. An eerie, macabre, and luminescent glow seemed to grow out from the sand at the foot of the largest sand dune on the point. It emerged dimly at first, almost like a concentrated swarm of unwinking fireflies as though viewed from a great distance, to steadily grow in intensity and glow with a phosphorescent greenish tinge. Still, the strange light grew brighter, as though rising up out of the sand, like shimmering green translucent smoke. They could hear the noise of a distant wind and a far-off crashing of violent sea-borne weather, even though the night about them remained calm and still. Just then, the bright green glow began to take form. It swirled and eddied for a few moments, wispy tendrils drifting and then gathering to a central core as they condensed into the vague shape of a tall and very thin old man. It was the ghost of the keeper. He pointed a long, bony finger to the Cervantes group, all staring in wonder at the bizarre apparition. Then, curling his hand over very slowly, he crooked the finger in wordless summons. Silently they rose as one, almost as though in a hypnotic trance, and slowly walked up the beach towards the glowing figure of the ghost. While the apparition was truly frightening by any measure, still no one felt afraid. It seemed they knew the ghost meant them no harm, and if anything might provide some desperately needed hope for the battle to come. At last they gathered around and stared up at the glowing figure, the greenish light bathing the upturned eyes and faces in its eerie radiance. At length the keeper spoke, the gravelly voice sending chills through the group like ripples in a pond, although still no one felt any real sense of fear in spite of the eerie vision now speaking to them from another dimension somewhere beyond the grave. His words washed over the group. "The time is upon me to hand over the precious treasure that lies buried here beneath." The keeper looked down for a moment, his long straggly hair blowing on an unfelt breeze, before looking back to the group. "You gathered here this night are the rightful owners, the chosen few, who will take charge of this treasure I have guarded so carefully for many centuries." His watery, deep-set grey eyes had a far-away look in them, as though looking back down through the years to the beginning of time. "The coming war must be won by you, the Cervantes pirates, and it must be won at all costs, for this most precious and powerful item buried here must never fall into the hands of evil. And as you know, the man who seeks it is as evil as the devil himself." He paused and regarded the group with careful scrutiny, taking in the full measure of them and making balanced judgment of their worth. They looked back with innocent eyes, still not speaking nor fully understanding the meaning of what was being said. "The treasure has been held secure for this moment in time. For long, long ago it was written in the stars that this war would come, and that you brave few would be the defenders. But you must understand the nature of this powerful bounty I bestow upon you, For while it is the most valuable of all possessions bar none, it must be used with wisdom and great care. And know this, that all men will seek it. Only but a few will attain it, and you must keep charge of it until the end of time. A new age is about to come upon the earth, and this treasure will assist the many changes about to take place. The keeper then drifted back from the spot he had been hovering over and pointed his bony finger downward. "Now dig," he commanded. At once the group set to the task with either hands, several running back down the beach to fetch digging tools from the makeshift camp around the fire. As they dug deep into the sand, it seemed that the stars above shone even brighter, almost as though the entire universe had suddenly moved in a little closer to the earth. The keeper hovered motionless and watched over the digging in complete silence, his eyes fixed upon the widening rim of the hole. At last it was Michael who gave up the shout that they had been waiting for. "I found something! Yes, I found the treasure chest!" In seconds they had cleared away the last of the sand and pried the damp chest from the bottom of the hole. Willing hands passed it up from the depths and placed it carefully at the feet of the keeper. At length he spoke again. "Stand back," he commanded as the group moved to step away from the treasure chest. The keeper drew an ancient sword from beneath his flowing greatcoat and carefully touched it to the lock of the chest. The sharp crack and bright flame took the group by surprise as it lit up the surrounding sand dunes for a great distance. But when they looked again, the treasure chest lay wide open, and inside rested the largest book they'd ever seen. It seemed to give off a golden, pulsating glow, and at once had the group almost fully hypnotized. "Oh my goodness!" exclaimed Kylie, who had turned her eyes away for a moment to look up. "Look, everyone! Look up at the stars!" All eyes then looked upward to see the stars shining brighter than they had ever done before. They seemed to sparkle like diamonds of fire in the dark of the night, and their countless multitude was absolutely breathtaking. "What does it mean?" asked Sarah. "Why is all this happening to us?" The keeper's ancient face wrinkled into what some imagine must have been a smile, although clearly this was a rare occurrence. "What you see before you is the book of all wisdom and absolute truth. He paused for a moment and took stock of the thoughtful faces, and then spoke again. "You now see the stars more clearly than ever before, because you are in the presence of absolute truth. It will always allow you to see everything more clearly, and your souls will know true happiness and freedom through truth and knowledge. But be warned, it must be used for good and good only. This is why I have waited all this time to pass this irreplaceable gift into the right hands. You were chosen for this task long before any of you were born." The keeper looked up to the stars, then stared out across the darkened ocean for a long moment before he spoke again, his ghostly face suddenly becoming a picture of anger and scorn, while the eyes seemed to burn like distant suns from another universe. "A great danger draws near, and will be upon you at the rising of the sun. Your enemies know you expect them, and are at this very moment sailing down the coast so as to spring a surprise attack from the south at first light. They believe you will be expecting them from the north. You must arrange your ships to beat them at their own game. I can do no more. Go now and ready your ships for the battle. This fateful day is soon upon us, and you must win this battle at all costs. Do you understand me?" "Yes, we understand," came the unanimous reply. Then I bid all of you here, as indeed I bid the burdensome shackles of this earthly realm, a final farewell. Good luck and Godspeed. He raised both arms as he began to fade into the surrounding darkness, the last call coming faintly as though from the end of a long tunnel. Hurry now, the danger is close at hand. Hurry. And then nothing. The Cervantes pirates then ran to their ships in haste, greatly excited at being given the enemy's plan of attack. Cameron and his team remained ashore in order to look after the wounded Matthew and guard the precious book of knowledge. The rest was soon clambering aboard their ships and weighing anchor in the dark, the drawing rattle of an anchor chains and zipping swish of wet rope being drawn tight rang out around Ronsard Bay. The battle was about to commence. Before the first rays of pastel daybreak filtered out from the eastern horizon into the Pinnacle's desert sky, the mast-tips and distant sails of the Dynamite Bay pirate ships appeared through the swirling sea mist away to the south. A bank of low-lying cloud began to take the soft colours of morning above the ocean, and a light breeze assisted its lazy passage across a clear blue sky. The waters off the shanty towns of Wedge Island and Grey were calm and unruffled, but all too soon were rent with the hissing wakes of the Dynamite Bay warships making full speed on their passage north. With the rising of the sun, the breeze had begun to stiffen, billowing out the warship sails with the occasional slap and crack of tightening canvas bouncing out across the calm waters. Throughout the long night they had made the southward passage, keeping well offshore until an hour before the first light of dawn they swung around and came in closer to the shoreline for the short northern run. The Pinnacles off to the starboard took on the light from the glowing sunrise, looking for all the world like the ruins of some ancient civilization, their long pointing shadows quickly growing into sharp relief in the dark yellow sand. The Dynamite Bay war fleet made swift progress, steering ever closer inshore as they moved up to Cervantes in the hope of maintaining the vital element of surprise. Standing on the bridge of the lead ship, Skull Gully Raider, stood Bloodbeard, the light of the burning dawn sun painting his shaggy beard an even deeper red. His hooded eyes held fast to the spyglass fixed on the prow of Thirsty Point as it came into view in the distance, and his body tensed with eager excitement at the spilling of blood to come. He turned to his chief mate and barked a sharp command to signal the war fleet to form up into battle formation. "Aye, aye, Captain," snapped the mate, and hurriedly passed the order on to the signaller, who ran the signal halyard aloft. The line of colourful signals ran high to flutter wildly in the stiffening breeze, and at once the following ships began to manoeuvre into a line astern. Bloodbeard's carefully thought-out plan of attack was to round Thirsty Point in battle line astern to arrive at an oblique angle to the unsuspecting and presumably north-facing Cervantes ships defending Ronsard Bay. He would then swing his ships in a line to engage them from the rear, full broadside on. The awesome firepower of his war fleet would very soon devastate what he called those puny Cervantes fishing boats, and he laughed aloud as he turned the helm to steer around the point. Off to his port passed the Cervantes Islands, and he scarcely gave them a glance as the bulky mainsails took the breeze while he tacked further into the wind. The ships in line astern followed his lead, a perfect battle line. Then, out from behind the Cervantes Islands glided the captured corsair, quickly taking the breeze and picking up speed, cutting in sharp as though in a hurry to join the battle line. Bloodbeard noted the smaller ship and swung his spyglass to take a closer look. On deck he could see some of the crew gathered at the bow waving hats at his battle fleet. The remainder stood on the midships gunwale, looking particularly stiff, an attitude he assumed was in respectful attention. Satisfied, he swung the spyglass back in the direction of Thirsty Point, keenly watching for any lookout ships that might sound the alarm. He saw none, but kept steady focus up ahead, a savage grin splitting his beard into an ugly gash. It was then Hamish and Corey unfurled the sails of the Cervantes' lead attack frigates, Sea Venture and Nomad. These ships, also hidden behind the Cervantes Islands, to now enjoin the battle in a classic naval tactic known as crossing the T. The lively morning wind filled the sails in an instant as the ships suddenly sprang from hiding behind the islands to charge straight at the Dynamite Bay line, now passing just a few hundred metres in front of them at 90 degrees. The small, onward-rushing bows of the Cervantes attack craft making almost impossible targets for the lumbering men of war. Incredibly, no alarm had sounded for the first few minutes, so intent were the Dynamite Bay invaders upon watching and waiting for the Corsair to change course as she steadfastly zeroed in on the third ship of the line. It was clear that unless she came about quickly, a collision was inevitable. The Dynamite Bay pirates soon sensed something was wrong when they saw white smoke coming from within the Corsair, as the crew members who had moments ago been waving from the bow suddenly ran aft and scrambled from the afterdeck into an escape rowboat trailing behind. But this tactic could only be seen from the ships further back towards the end of the line.